Sit down, Flynn, and for heaven's sake, stop pacing my floor as though it were a suspect.
They've stood me down, Maud. 11 years I've spent building cases against other men. I did not expect the next one to be built against me.
He did sit, eventually, though he did it the way a man sits in a room he does not trust. I poured no tea. It did not seem the moment for it, and Flynn is not a man who wants comforting when he wants answering. Tell me all of it, Flynn. Not the version you've already rehearsed for the Commissioner. The other one. He told me. An anonymous letter, delivered to Sir Aldous' own residence 3 nights prior. A ledger page, showing a raid gone conveniently empty some months back. And worse, a signed statement from a man Flynn swears he has never taken so much as a shilling from, claiming otherwise in specific damning detail.
A civilian witness, Maud. Not whispers in a corridor, a signed statement, with a name attached to it. Sir Aldous had no choice in the matter. I am stood down pending inquiry, and I am not permitted to so much as look sideways at my own case.
I watched his hands as he said it. Flynn's hands are usually the steadiest thing about him. They were not steady now. And you don't know whether this comes from within the yard? Or from somewhere outside it?
No. That is rather the devil of it. It might be a man I've sent down. It might be a man I take my tea with every morning. I've spent 3 nights making a list of everyone I have ever wronged, in either capacity. And I find the list distressingly long for a man who believed himself reasonably fair.
I did not tell him then that I found this admission rather more moving than he intended it to be. There will be time enough for that. Or there will not. Well, you cannot investigate it. I am under no such restriction.
Maud.
You came to my office at an hour better suited to sleep, Flynn, and you did not come to be talked out of it. I'm taking the case. You may argue with me about my fee at some later date, when you are back in Sir Aldous' good graces and drawing a wage again. He did not argue. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who had been braced for a much longer fight and found he did not need to have it. He left near midnight, collar up against the damp, and did not look back at the window. I stood by it a good while regardless.
A case with no client in the ordinary sense. For the accused cannot hire an investigator to clear his own name and be seen to do it honestly. Maud West will have to do this one quietly and carry it herself. We return for Act 2.
Sir Aldous Grantham's office smells of pipe tobacco and old paper, and he receives visitors from behind a desk large enough to make most men feel they are being interviewed for a position they haven't applied for. I have never found it worked on me, which I believe is precisely why he doesn't mind having me in it. I intend to look into Inspector Flynn's matter, Sir Aldous. Independently. I've no wish to obstruct your own men, only to say plainly that I'm doing it, rather than have you discover it sideways.
Miss West, I rather expected you within the week. Flynn thinks a great deal of your discretion, though he'd never say so in those words.
He wouldn't, no.
I'll tell you plainly what I told my own inquiry. I don't believe it of him. I've known Flynn 12 years, and whatever else the man is, he has never once been for sale. But belief isn't evidence, Miss West, and I'm obliged to treat the accusation as though it might be true until it's proven otherwise. That's the devil of the position I'm in, as much as the one he's in.
I found I believed him. Sir Aldous does not have the face for dishonesty. It is too well used to plainer things. Then we want the same outcome, Sir Aldous. I'll try not to trip over your investigators. I make no promises about your investigators not tripping over me.
I'd expect nothing else. I've put Sergeant Corbin onto the internal inquiry. A good man, thorough, fond enough of Flynn that his diligence won't want for care. You may find him useful, or he may find you a nuisance. Time will tell which.
I made a note of the name. I did not at the time make anything more of it than that. It is a fact I have turned over a great many times since, and found no comfort in the turning.
Every inquiry must begin somewhere, and Maud West begins hers where the motive is plainest to see. We return for Act 3, The Nearer Candidate.
There is a particular sort of resentment that does not announce itself. It simply sits in a man's posture, in the set of his mouth, when another's name is mentioned in the room. Detective Inspector Richard Reeves has that sort of resentment, and he has had, I should think, a great deal of practice at not letting it show. He and Flynn are both up for the same posting. Reeves has waited longer for it. I found him in his office on the second floor, a room considerably tidier than Flynn's, with the particular bareness of a man who does not wish to be read by his surroundings. Detective Inspector Reeves, I wonder if you might spare a few minutes.
Miss West, I confess I wondered when you'd come round to me. I understand you're looking into the business with Flynn.
I am. I understand you and he are both being considered for the same rank.
We are, and I understand what you're driving at, and I'll save you the trouble of driving at it politely. Yes, I'd have liked the posting. Yes, I've waited longer for it than a younger man who's had rather more luck than sense, in my opinion. No, I did not write any letter, anonymous or otherwise, and I'll thank you not to imply it twice in the same conversation.
He said it without heat, which I confess made me trust him rather less than if he'd shouted. You requested one of Flynn's old case files some weeks back, before any of this began. A small pause. The first genuine hesitation I'd had from him.
I did. A cross-reference. Nothing more. The Aldgate business, if you must know, and you're welcome to confirm it with the registry yourself. I'd rather you did, in fact, and had done with wondering about me.
Where were you, Inspector, the evening the letter was delivered?
Walking. Alone. I do that some evenings, when the day's been a poor one. I've no one to vouch for it, and I'm aware how that sounds, coming from a man in my position, saying it to a woman investigating a corruption charge.
He did not flinch from the admission, which I noted. Guilty men, in my experience, tend either to over-explain or to grow suddenly suspiciously vague. Reeves did neither. He simply told me an unflattering, uncorroborated truth, and let me make of it what I would. I left him unconvinced of his innocence, and equally unconvinced of his guilt, which is, I have found, rather the usual condition of an investigation in its second day. The registry clerk was a narrow, obliging young man who plainly regarded my visit as the most interesting thing to happen to him in some weeks. The Aldgate file was exactly where it ought to be, exactly as unremarkable as Reeves had claimed. A minor fraud matter, closed 18 months prior, with a cross-reference to a witness Reeves had apparently once arrested himself. It told me nothing about corruption. It told me, rather, that Reeves had been telling the truth about one thing at least. One thread, then, thinning rather than tightening. I confess, I felt no great satisfaction in it. A shorter list of suspects ought to comfort an investigator. It only ever seems to worry me further.
One thread thins, another, considerably more dangerous, waits along the river. On to Act 4, the Riverside Ledger.
The empty raid the letter spoke of had taken place at a warehouse along Wapping High Street, some 3 months prior. A smuggling concern by all accounts, though the sort that keeps its books cleaner than most legitimate trades. I went to see it for myself, well after dark, on the theory that a man's true business is rarely conducted in daylight, and rarer still in front of witnesses who might remember his face. I found a doorway with a decent view, and made myself as much a part of the shadow as a woman in a good coat is able to manage. There is a rhythm to watching a place like that, the same as watching a room at a dinner party. Who moves when? Who is permitted to linger? Who is not? A man came and went twice with nothing in his hands. A cart arrived and was unloaded with more care than its cargo of machine parts seemed to warrant, and twice I heard mention, low, half-caught, of an arrangement, and of the usual envelope. I had no name to put to the envelope, only the certainty now that one existed, and that it was being handed to someone who did not work the docks for his living. I had grown, I think, a shade too confident in my own shadow.
Oi, who's that then, skulking by the Fitch warehouse?
Woman, by the look of her. Best bring her round to Mr. Dray, see what he makes of it.
I'm quite lost, gentlemen, and grateful for the direction, though I hardly think a lady wandering off her road warrants an audience with anybody in particular. It did not answer. It rarely does, once men have already decided what use to make of you.
I had gone to her office to report a small thing about the ledger, nothing that seemed, at the time, worth the hour, and found the room empty and a scrap of paper by the lamp with a whopping address in her hand. I have rarely covered a mile so quickly while trying, with everything in me, to appear to be in no hurry whatsoever. A man cannot arrive at a smuggler's dock as a detective inspector, suspended or otherwise, without inviting exactly the sort of attention that gets a woman thrown in the river before anyone troubles to ask questions. So I did not arrive as one. Now then, lads, is this the way to the anchor? Or have I gone and got myself thoroughly lost?
Get out of it, you old soak. This isn't the night for it.
It bought her 3 seconds. It did not need to buy more than that. I am told later that I fight rather better drunk than sober, which I choose to take as a professional compliment and nothing more.
We did not speak until we had put 2 streets between ourselves and the river. Flynn's performance of drunkenness had not entirely worn off, though I could not have said, watching him, how much of the unsteadiness remaining was theatre, and how much was simply a man who had just done something considerably more dangerous than his suspension permitted him to do.
Do you have any idea what you were doing?
My work, Flynn. The same as always.
Your work doesn't usually end with 3 men deciding whether to put you in the river.
No. That part keeps occurring. He did not laugh. I had rather hoped he would.
The river keeps its secrets close and gives up only fragments to those brave or foolish enough to go looking. What was said between them after, on a bench within sound of the water, is a rather quieter sort of secret. We return for Act 5, The Bench by the Water.
He found a bench without asking whether I wanted one, and put his coat about my shoulders without asking that either. It smelled of damp wool, and, faintly, of the dock. I did not tell him to stop.
You might have told me where you were going.
You're stood down, Flynn. You'd no business being anywhere near it.
And yet I was, which rather answers the question of what I'd have done with the information had you given it to me honestly instead of leaving me to find your office empty and a scrap of paper by the lamp.
I didn't want you to worry.
I worry regardless, Maud. The only variable is whether I'm close enough to do something about it.
We sat a while without either of us managing the next sentence. The river went on making its ordinary sound, indifferent to both of us, which I found I did not mind. You fought rather well, for a drunk man who wasn't one.
I shall take that as the professional compliment I'm fairly sure you didn't intend it as.
It was, in fact, exactly the compliment I had intended, though I did not see the use in telling him so directly. Some things travel better sideways.
There was a thing I meant to tell you before all this. Before the doc. It's why I came to your office in the first place, that evening, not merely to fret about the ledger.
What thing, Flynn?
It has kept this long already.
I did not press him. I have learned, across a great many cases and rather fewer conversations of this particular kind, that a thing a man says will keep is very often the one thing he most wants asked after, and that asking too soon only teaches him to say it will keep again, the next time, and the time after that. So I let it keep, for now. Come along, Flynn. It's a poor hour, and I still owe Sir Aldous a promise not to trip over his investigators. I can hardly keep it sitting on a bench till dawn. He rose when I did, and returned my step to the pavement with a hand under my elbow that lingered, I thought, a moment longer than strictly necessary for a woman in no danger of stumbling. Neither of us remarked upon it.
The Thames keeps its own counsel, and so for now does Inspector Flynn. But an investigation does not pause for a man's reticence, and there is a pawnbroker in Clerkenwell who has not yet told Maud West the truth. Next, Act 6. The Pawnbroker of Clerkenwell.
Clerkenwell wears its trades on its sleeve. Clockmakers, jewellers, and the pawnbrokers who deal in what's left when the other two trades have finished with a man. Tobias Wren's shop sat between a watchmaker's and a shuttered chandler's, narrow as a coffin and twice as gloomy, with barred windows that let in more suspicion than light. He was behind the counter when the bell announced me, and his face did the particular thing a man's face does when he has been half expecting a caller he would rather not receive.
Help you, miss?
Mr. Wren, I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time. I understand your son had some trouble with the police some years back. A trouble that involved Inspector Flynn, I believe.
I don't know what you're driving at. I told the commissioner's men what I saw, and that's the whole of it. Signed my name to it and all.
I'm not suggesting you invented anything, Mr. Wren. Only that a man's memory can be persuaded by feeling now and again, without his meaning any harm by it. It would hardly be the first time a father's carried a grievance longer than he knew he was carrying it. I meant it kindly. I believed in that moment that I was offering the man a door out of his own story, a chance to admit to bitterness rather than falsehood, which seemed to me the lesser sin and the more forgivable one.
I've no grievance, miss. Only what I saw. A man come round, gave his name plain as you like. Inspector Flynn, he said, and I'd no cause to doubt him.
And you're quite certain of the face, Mr. Wren? It was an evening visit, I understand. The gas lamp in this street wants mending, if I recall the walk down correctly.
Certain enough. I'd not have signed my name to it otherwise.
He repeated the particulars almost word for word as he'd given them before. The same phrases, the same order. Like a man reciting rather than remembering. I read it then, as the rehearsal of a grievance grown comfortable with its own telling. I did not yet know to read it as the rehearsal of a lie. I left him without having broken anything, and told myself this was patience rather than failure. I am not certain, looking back on it, that I believed myself entirely.
She told me of the pawnbroker in careful, measured terms, a grieving father, she thought, embittered rather than dishonest, his memory perhaps unreliable, but his conscience, in her judgment, largely clear. So, we've nothing. A man who may or may not bear me a grudge, saying things that may or may not be true.
That is rather the shape of most investigations in their early hours, Flynn. I'd have thought you'd remember that, under ordinary circumstances.
These aren't ordinary circumstances. Forgive me. It's no comfortable thing sitting on the outside of one's own case, watching another do the work one is better suited to do oneself.
No, I don't imagine it is.
A grieving father or a frightened one? Maud West has yet to learn which. The answer, when it comes, will not come from sympathy. On to Act 7. The flourish that wasn't his.
I had, by that third evening, very nearly exhausted the patience of both Reeves and Dray as suspects, and found myself, as one does when the obvious roads run out, returning to the one piece of evidence I had not yet properly examined on its own terms, the ledger page itself, rather than the theories I had built atop it. I laid it beside 3 genuine specimens of Flynn's hand, an old case memo, a note from his desk, and, rather sentimentally, a card he had sent following the Vienna business, which I had kept for reasons I did not, at the time, care to examine too closely. At a glance, the forgery is excellent, a patient man's work, done with a steady hand and a genuine sample close at his elbow. It would deceive a magistrate. It very nearly deceived me. But Flynn has a habit, in his hand, that I do not believe he is even aware of. A particular flourish on the tail of a lower-case y, curling back on itself in a way no copying clerk's manual would teach a man to imitate, because it serves no purpose whatsoever save being, simply, his. It was missing. Every Y on that ledger page ran straight and correct and utterly without character. The hand of a careful man who had never once seen Flynn write in a hurry. I sat with that a good while, turning it under the lamp, before I permitted myself to be certain of it. Certainty in this trade is a luxury one earns rather slowly, and spends rather too quickly if one isn't careful. A forger who copies so faithfully has generally worked from a genuine sample close to hand, not merely seen once, but studied. I turned to the question of who, among the men with cause to dislike Flynn or reason to want him gone, would have had a memo of his sitting on a desk long enough to learn it by heart. The duty roster gave me my answer before I had properly finished asking the question. Sergeant Corbin had signed for the return of an old case file. Flynn's file. Some 11 days before the anonymous letter reached Sir Aldous' residence. Filed correctly. Returned correctly. Entirely unremarkable to any eye that hadn't spent the evening staring at the tail of a lower-case y. Sergeant Corbin, who had been so generous with his time. Sergeant Corbin, who had gently agreed, on 2 occasions I could now recall with considerable clarity, that Reeves did seem the likelier man, and that the docks did seem the likelier place. I had thought him helpful. I had been, I realised, rather thoroughly managed. I did not go to Sir Aldous that night. A suspicion, however well-founded, is not yet a case, and I had learned enough, over a great many years in this profession, not to move against a man wearing the Yard's own uniform until I could put the whole of it beyond any reasonable arguing. There was still Wren. There was still somewhere the money itself, and where it had gone. But I slept that night for the first time in some days without turning the case over and over in the dark, and I believe that alone told me how certain I had become.
A name at last, though a name is not yet proof, and Maud West does not deal in accusations she cannot stand behind. There remains a pawnbroker in Clerkenwell with one truth still owed. We return for Act 8. What the pawnbroker owed.
I did not open gently, this time. I had spent the walk from the omnibus stop deciding against it, and I do not, as a rule, revisit a decision once I have properly made it.
Back again, miss. I've told you what I know.
You've told me what you were paid to say, Mr. Wren, which is a rather different article, and I think you know it as well as I do. A stillness came over him then. Not the stillness of a man affronted, but the particular, smaller stillness of a man who has just heard a door he'd hoped was still bolted swing open regardless. You cleared Aldridge's note in November. £11, 6 shillings. A considerable sum for a man in your position to find all at once, in a poor year, with a shop no better stocked than this one. I find myself wondering where a man finds £11, 6 shillings so suddenly, Mr. Wren. And I confess, Inspector Flynn's name is not the answer that occurs to me first.
I don't have to answer that.
No, you don't. But the alternative, I think, is answering a great many similar questions in a room considerably less private than this one, in front of men considerably less patient with a shopkeeper's silence than I am prepared to be this morning. The man who came to you, not Flynn. The real one, tall or short.
Middling, neither one nor the other.
A yard coat or plain clothes?
Plain, but he had the manner of a copper about him. The way he stood, like he was used to being obeyed and didn't much care for asking twice.
It was not Flynn. It could not have been Flynn, who has never in his life had the manner of a man used to being obeyed. Only the manner of a man doing his level best to deserve obedience, which I have come to understand is a considerably rarer thing. But it fit another man very well indeed.
He said it wouldn't matter much, that an inspector like that he'd be cleared eventually, no real harm done, and I'd have my note paid and my boy's name left well alone in the meantime. I didn't think. I don't suppose it matters now what I thought.
No, not much. But it will matter that you told me the truth of it now, Mr. Wren. That much, I think, will count for something. When the time comes to say who did what and why. He was not a wicked man, only a frightened one, offered a way out of a debt by someone who understood exactly how a frightened man reasons, and used that understanding the way another man might use a key. I have met a great many wicked men in this profession. I find I have rather less patience left over these days for the merely desperate ones who are made to do a wicked man's work for him.
A name confirmed, a debt explained, a forgery traced to a man's own hand. The case that could not clear itself is very nearly cleared. What remains is the harder part, proving it and bringing it to the one place it can no longer be denied. And now Act 9, the case assembled.
She laid it out for me in order, the way she does when she wants a thing understood rather than merely believed. The flourish missing from the why, the duty roster, the debt Wren cleared in November, the description that fit a man of middling height with a policeman's manner and none of his scruple. A description that isn't mine, a debt cleared in November, and a ledger page that doesn't match my hand under close examination. That's rather more than we had this morning.
It's rather more than we've had all week, Flynn.
Careful, Maud. You'll have me thinking you're pleased with me.
I'm pleased with the case, Flynn. You've simply had the good fortune to be standing rather near it.
She'd put the biscuits out again, as she always does, and as I have made something of a habit of leaving them untouched. I could not for the life of me have told you why until that afternoon, when I found I hadn't the will to keep up the habit any longer. I took one. She did not remark upon it, though I saw her notice. There remains the small matter of Corbin himself. We have a name, and a strong one, but a flourish and a description won't hang a sergeant's coat on a peg by themselves. Sir Aldous will want more before he moves against a man of the yard on evidence a defence counsel could call circumstantial.
Then we shall get him more, Flynn. Dray's operation has been paying somebody for the better part of a year, and Dray, I think, cares a great deal less for protecting his source now that his own neck is the one nearest the noose. A man like that doesn't stay loyal past the point it costs him something.
You mean to go back to the docks?
I mean for us to go back to the docks, Flynn, together and in daylight, and with rather less need for either of us to pretend to be drunk. He did, at that, actually laugh. Briefly, and as though the sound had surprised him as much as it did me. It is, I think, a particular kind of happiness. Quieter than most, and entirely unfit for public display. To watch a man come slowly back into his own shape after days of being made to feel he had none. I did not say this to him. Some things, as I have said before, travel better sideways, and this one, I thought, would keep a little longer yet.
The evidence gathers. The net, such as it is, draws slowly closed. But a man like Silas Dray does not give up a source for nothing, and Maud West is about to learn precisely what he wants in exchange. We return for Act 10, Dray's Price.
Silas Dray received us, in the end, not because he wished to, but because Flynn had sent word ahead through channels I did not ask too closely about, making plain that this conversation could happen quietly, across a desk, or considerably less quietly, across a courtroom, and that the choice was entirely his to make. He was younger than I had expected of a man who ran so much of the river trade below Wapping, sharp-suited for a warehouse, with the particular wariness of a man who has spent a long while calculating exactly how much trouble he is presently worth to the people who might wish to make trouble for him.
Miss West. Inspector. Or is it Inspector still, this week? I'd heard rumours.
The rumours are somewhat premature, Mr. Dray, as I imagine you're rather better informed than most as to why.
I'm informed of a great many things, Inspector. It's rather the nature of my trade.
Then you'll be informed enough to know precisely why we've come. You've had a man on your payroll inside the yard for the better part of a year. We don't want him, not particularly, and not from you. We want to know his name, confirmed from your own mouth, and we want to know it plainly enough to put before the Commissioner.
And why should I hand you a man who served me rather well, when silence has cost me nothing so far?
Because silence is about to cost you a great deal more than it has, Mr. Dray. Inspector Flynn's suspension has occupied the whole of the yard's attention for the better part of a fortnight. Attention that has not, in that time, been available to spend on you. That courtesy ends today, one way or another. The only question remaining is whether it ends with your name in a ledger of its own, or merely his.
He never gave a name. Called himself nothing at all the first time. Just an envelope. Left where I'd said, and a nod when it was collected proper. Took me the better part of 2 months before I had so much as a face to put to it.
And when you had the face, Mr. Dray?
Sergeant. Never gave more than that. Middling height, careful sort of man, the kind who counts his own money twice before he trusts another man's counterfeit. I'd not have known his rank at all except he let it slip once, complaining of a detective inspector he didn't much care for. Someone he reckoned had it too easy. coming up so quick behind him?
He did not say Corbyn's name. He did not need to. I had heard, by then, quite enough of the shape of the man to know exactly whose outline it made. A bad business, and no mistake, though I confess I felt no great surprise at hearing the shape of it confirmed.
That's the whole of what I know, and rather more than I'd meant to give you for nothing, Miss West.
You'll find it wasn't entirely for nothing, Mr. Dray. A man who hands over a name today is a rather more sympathetic figure to a magistrate than one who's still protecting it when the whole business finally comes to light. And I think you know that arithmetic rather better than I do. Dray said nothing further to that, which I took, on the whole, to be agreement.
We walked some way before either of us spoke, and when Maud finally did, it was not of Corbyn at all.
You were rather good back there, letting me lead. Not every man of your rank finds that easy.
You'd have led regardless of what I found easy, Maud. I've learned over the better part of a year that it's generally the wiser course to let you.
It was, I think, the nearest thing to a compliment Flynn has ever paid me regarding my profession rather than my person, and I confess I turned it over for rather longer than its size alone would seem to warrant.
The name is confirmed 3 times over now, by a forger's own hand, by a frightened man's memory, and by a smuggler's ledger of debts owed. There remains only the matter of bringing it before the one man with the authority to act on it. And now, Act 11, laid before the Commissioner.
I had asked for the meeting myself, and asked that Flynn be permitted to attend it, though not to speak first. A small point of procedure Sir Aldous granted without argument, which told me something of how the wind was already blowing in that office, whatever the official record still said. Sir Aldous, I've come to lay the whole of it before you, and I'd ask you to hear it through before you say anything at all, including, if I may be so bold, anything about procedure.
You may be as bold as you like, Miss West. I find I've rather come to expect it of you. Go on.
I laid it out as I had laid it out for Flynn, the flourish missing from the forged ledger's hand, the duty roster showing Corbyn's access to Flynn's old file 11 days before the letter arrived, Wren's description of a middling, careful man with a policeman's manner, and Dray's own account of a sergeant who'd let slip his resentment of the inspector coming up too quick behind him.
Corbyn. You're telling me it's Corbyn?
I'm telling you the evidence points there, and points there consistently, from 4 separate directions that had no occasion to agree with one another beforehand. I don't ask you to take my word for the man's guilt, Sir Aldous. I ask you to take my word that it's worth your own investigators examining that ledger page against a sample of Corbyn's hand, rather than Flynn's, before another day passes.
Corbyn was assigned to my own inquiry. I put him there myself, on the strength of his diligence. If you're right, Miss West, I have had the fox inside the henhouse from the very first day, examining his own trail and finding it, each time, remarkably cold.
You're not the first good man to have trusted a bad one, Sir Aldous, and you'll not be the last. The trusting isn't the failing. What you do with the evidence, now that it's in front of you, is the only part that's still within your power to get right.
You've always had a talent for making a hard truth easier to swallow, without ever once softening it, Miss West. Very well. I'll have the ledger examined properly, against Corbyn's own hand, before the day is out. And I'll want Wren's statement taken down formally, and Dray's account too, if he'll give it again to a man with a warrant card, rather than a private inquirer's charm.
He'll give it. I rather think he's already decided which side of this to be found standing on.
Sir Aldous, there's a ceremony scheduled for Thursday next. My own, as it happens, assuming any of this is resolved by then.
It will be resolved by then, Inspector, or I'll want to know the reason why. I find I've rather had my fill of Sergeant Corbyn's diligence. It would please me a great deal to see it answered for in front of the very room it was meant to deceive.
There was something fitting in that, though I did not yet know how fitting until Thursday actually arrived. Sir Aldous is not, as a rule, a man given to theatre. But even the plainest of men, I have found, will permit himself a little of it, when the theatre in question is also justice.
Thursday next was meant to be Inspector Flynn's finest hour, publicly earned and long delayed. It very nearly became something else instead. The hour a corrupt man's diligence went unanswered, and an innocent one paid for it. Sergeant Corbyn does not yet know how near he came to getting away with it. We'll pause there a moment. If you're listening to Micropulse, we'd very much like to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what the hour is where you are. Leave it in the comments below. Every note helps this community along, and we read each one. And if you'd like to see where Morden Flynn's story first began, back before the docks, before the Savoy, before any of it, have a look at The Vanishing Necklace, the very first case where Morden Flynn meet. It's rather a fine place to start if you haven't already. Now back to Act 12, the ceremony.
They had done the room properly for it, the Commissioner's own reception hall, polished within an inch of itself, glasses arranged in careful ranks for a toast that had not yet been given. I was not part of the ceremony, properly speaking. A private inquirer has no standing in a room of yard men marking one of their own, and I had made my peace with that some hours before, standing rather further back than I might otherwise have chosen. I saw Reeves near the front, looking, for the first time since I had met him, entirely without resentment. He raised his glass toward Flynn before the toast had even properly begun, and I confess it did him rather more credit than I had been prepared to give him a fortnight prior. I saw Corbyn too, nearer the back than Reeves, watching the room with the particular stillness of a man who believes the evening still belongs to him in some fashion. It was done quietly. In the end, no shout, no scene. Only two of Sir Aldous' own men crossing to the back of the room with the particular unhurried purpose of men who have done this precise thing a great many times before, and know better than to make more of it than it deserves.
Something the matter, gentlemen?
There was not by then any real question left in his voice. Only the last thin performance of a man who has already understood the answer and is simply delaying the moment of hearing it said aloud.
Detective Sergeant Corbyn, you'll come with these men now quietly and spare the room and yourself whatever's left of your dignity.
You'd have done the same, in my chair long enough, watching a younger man rise past you on nothing more than better luck and a cleaner face.
No, I don't believe I would have.
He did not look back at Flynn on his way out. A wrong-un to the last, I thought. Though I have always held that the truest tell of a guilty man is not what he says when he's caught, but what he can no longer bring himself to look at afterward. Sir Aldous took rather longer than the moment strictly required to compose himself before he spoke, and I thought none the less of him for it. A man had just been marched out of his own ceremony in irons, and here he was, expected to speak warmly of the very matter that had made it necessary.
I had meant to give a rather shorter speech than the one I find myself giving now. I will say only this. There are men in this service who mistake diligence for loyalty and ambition for merit, and there are men who understand those to be entirely separate virtues, only one of which is worth having. I have known Inspector Flynn 12 years, and I have never once had occasion to doubt which sort of man he is. A fact this last fortnight has tested rather more severely than I would have wished on him, and proved rather more thoroughly than I could have arranged on purpose. Detective Inspector Flynn, confirmed as of this evening, and rather overdue in the confirming.
I watched him receive it, the way he receives most things that matter to him greatly, with his jaw set and his eyes doing rather more of the work than his face otherwise permitted. I do not think I was the only person in that room who noticed. I believe I may have been the only one it undid quite so thoroughly. He found me rather than the other way about, which I noted, since it had generally been my habit throughout this whole business to be the one doing the finding.
I don't suppose Detective Inspector's rank comes with license to say what I'd like to in a room full of my superiors.
I shouldn't think so, Flynn. Congratulations does tend to cover it, for a room such as this one.
Then, congratulations will have to hold until I can say the rest of it properly.
I'll hold you to that, Detective Inspector. He was pulled away almost at once by well-wishers and superiors and the ordinary machinery of an evening such as that one, and I watched him go, and found I did not much mind the waiting, now that I finally knew there was a rest of it worth waiting for.
A case closed, a name cleared, a rank confirmed rather later than it ought to have been, but confirmed all the same. There remains only the small matter of an unpaid bill and a sentence left unfinished on a bench beside the river. We return for the unpaid bill.
He came by in the evening, some days after the ceremony, with an envelope in his hand, and the particular formality of a man using an errand as an excuse for a visit he has not yet found the courage to make without one.
Your fee. I've added a sum for the additional risk, the dock.
That wasn't part of our arrangement, Flynn.
No, it wasn't in the arrangement. I'm including it regardless.
I set the envelope aside without counting it, which is not like me, and which he noticed, I think, though he had the grace not to remark on it.
You'll recall the bench by the water. I told you there was a thing I'd meant to say, and that it would keep.
I recall it.
I find I've run rather short of reasons to let it keep any longer. I've spent a great many months telling myself that what stands between us is a connecting door or a case, or the good sense not to complicate an arrangement that suits us both rather well as it is. I no longer believe any of that, Maud. I think what has stood between us this whole while is simply that I had not yet said so.
I have built a career, in part, on knowing precisely what to say to a person at the moment they most need it said. I found, in that moment, that I had rather less to offer than my usual professional stock. Only 4 words, and not especially clever ones. Then say so, Flynn. He did not say so, not in words, but I have come to learn that some things are answered rather better than they are spoken, and he answered it, on that occasion, very well indeed. I will not set down here precisely how long the kettle sat forgotten, nor exactly what became of the fee he had come to pay, beyond noting that it remained, for some while, entirely uncounted on the edge of my desk. Some records, I have found, are better kept in memory than in a ledger.
I don't suppose you'll tell me this changes nothing about the professional arrangement.
I don't suppose I will, no.
Good. I'd rather hoped it wouldn't. I found, on my way out, that I'd hung my hat on the wrong peg entirely. A small, foolish thing, and not at all like me. It struck me as a rather fitting state of affairs for a man who had, by his own admission, left rather more than his hat unattended to that evening.
I have closed a great many cases from this desk, and written a great many reflections upon them, and I find this one wants rather less clever phrasing than most, and rather more honesty than I am generally in the habit of setting down on paper. Flynn is cleared. His name, which was never truly in question to anyone who knew him well, is now also not in question to anyone who merely reads a file. Corbyn will answer for two things now, not one, for what he did to Flynn, and for whatever quieter arrangement he'd made for himself along the river besides. Both are matters for Sir Aldous and the courts now, not for me, though I shouldn't think either offers Corbyn much comfort, wherever he presently sits. I find I think rather less about the case tonight than I do about a bench beside the water and a connecting door at the Savoy that I once decided was a mystery not meant to be solved. I believe I may have been wrong about that. Some mysteries, I am beginning to learn, are not meant to be left unsolved forever, only attended to carefully until the moment one is finally ready to answer them. The kettle has boiled twice tonight and been forgotten twice. I find I do not much mind starting it a third time. Until the next inquiry, I remain Maud West, Private Inquirer.
You've been listening to the case files of Maud West. Tonight's episode, A Case of His Own. Join us next time when another truth waits to be brought to light by whoever is patient enough and honest enough to go looking for it.